Hey folks, Steve here with a new video series in which we'll be looking at Joe Balkowski's The Korean War, June 1950 to May 1951, this being the designer signature edition published by Compass Games the last year. This is a game that has been reprinted and was originally, in its first incarnation, published way back in 1986. Will sound like Casey Kasem if you know who that is right there. But yeah, so we'll be taking a look at this game now. I'm going to warn you, you might feel a little motion sick for a second. I'm going to adjust the camera situation and whoop, zoom out and change the angle. And I've got the campaign game whoop, set up here on my table. Now, a couple of things. I've had to make some adjustments, do a little more motion here, and I've had to set up a different table format than I usually do. I usually have 3x3 tables pushed together, and I lay out the map there. But because of this edition, and sorry for the glare there, this edition has a very sprawling map, which you can see here. I had to set up my 2.5 by 8 foot tables, two of them together, which is a lot more table, and I maybe could have figured out another way to make this table configuration work, but more space is okay. I just may have some challenges leaning over the table to reach certain parts of the map, but we'll manage just fine. You can see I've got the map all set up. I've got many counters set up. There's a couple of tidbit of things I need to, sorry, the camera's being adjusted there. I'll still have to set up a few administrative counters on some of these tracks. You can see there's some down here for like the game turn track and reinforcements and a variety of different things that I've not yet quite set up. Main thing was making sure we got the units set up on the board. So a couple of things as we get started here. Just again, this is a reprint of what is considered by many a classic game. The Korean War from 1986 is usually thrown out there as sort of the game to play on the Korean War, at least one that will not take you forever to play. And Compass, as a part of the last few years, part of this effort by multiple publishers, more than just one, more than just Compass, in publishing these older classic games in new editions with the intent to update the graphics of the counter art, the map, do any rules refinements or inclusion of errata from decades ago, and kind of produce a whole new fresh product, especially for those who missed their opportunity to play the original classics in their original form, much like me. So it's a very convenient thing to be going on right now. And I had purchased this Korean War way back last year, or had it on pre-order even before that, to get it. And I'm now finally getting it to the table after a long delay. There's a couple of disclaimers I need to get out of the way very quickly. Back when this game was first produced and delivered to customers, there was, and I don't know if this is a curse of some Korean War games that are out there, there were some component challenges. These component challenges were, well, it really came in one primary function. The counter sheets that were by default included in the original batch of deliveries had counter sheets that were extremely thick, were difficult to get out of the counter sheets, and in many cases had some misalignments of the counter art and the numbers, the values on the counters, such that in some cases the game, as it was kind of not properly playable. Now, during that time period, Compass Games provided to those who had issues with their counters a set of replacement counter sheets that were thinner, the more standard, sort of like white core counter sheets that did not have alignment issues. When I received my copy, I had very slightly misaligned on one of the counter sheets, not enough that it impacted any of the number values, or at least they were all, to me, I could live with them. They were fine. So you may see from time to time, if I zoom in on a counter, that it may be a little shifted over to the right more than usual, and it might look like a sliver of something is cut off. I deem that acceptable to me, and I did not ask for replacement counters. If you're looking to buy this game, just straight out of the gate, I will say, when you get it, open it up, take a look at the counters, look at the alignment. If there is something wrong, contact Compass Games, and they should be able to get you straightened out. I am worried that that kerfuffle at the time of release has hurt this particular edition, this publishing of the game's Um, Presence on people's radar, I think that's unfortunate. For me, it was all fine. And I took the time to punch my counters and I did clip and round all of my counters. That probably contributed to the death of one of my clippers, but it worked out quite well. So I'll just show you an example of one of the counters. So here it is. This is a guard, or I'm sorry, a garrison. So it is quite thick. This is remarkably thick in terms of a counter. This made it kind of difficult to get off of the counter sheet, but is generally, was generally fine. And then rounding the corners, it's turned out quite nice. But this one doesn't have any particular issues with the content. So not really a big deal there. But for others, your experience may vary, and so just be at the ready. I don't know if Compass Games has now taken the time to put the refined counter sheets in the boxes so that folks don't have to have a separate shipment. I just don't really know what's going on, because again, I received mine as part of pre-order, so it came, I decided it was fine, and I didn't ask for new counters, so I cannot show you what those look like. But from what I've heard, they are appropriate. They're just a different thickness, but they're perfectly playable and is fine. Okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, I can talk a little bit more about the game itself. First things first, the map is bigger than the original edition. So again, as a change from the original game to the new game, this map is much bigger. In fact, it is 4 separate maps that, if depending on what scenario you're playing, you don't have to have them all set up. You can use 1 or 2 of them instead. Map A is the very southern part of the peninsula. Map B is the next chunk. And then Map C is the first part of the northern area of operations. And then Map D being sort of that eastern chunk. And so you do need, a certain amount of length, or I'm sorry, width and length to fit this on. And then you also have a number of different game charts and player aids that you may want to have nearby on the table. So you're going to need a pretty decent table footprint. My understanding is that has been somewhat of an issue for people because the original game, I want to say, was a 2-mapper or something like that. And that is all because this game has been bloomed up a little bit. So the map is bigger because the hexes are bigger, because the counters are bigger. And I will say, I like the size of the counters. Like, they do fit very comfortably in one's hand. You can pick them up. You can use tweezers if you want, forceps, and they do just fine. So, for me, it's not a problem because I have a big table. I have a game room that I can leave this up as long as I want. But it could prove a great challenge to people. So kind of a bummer maybe for some who are constrained in their logistics at home. And I'll say, generally, I do not like the map art. Now, that's not to say it's terrible, and it doesn't mean I hate it. I just don't like it compared to what I think it maybe could have been. So what's really interesting about this map is that it is almost like a topographical map that you might see in certain contexts where they're showing different colors based on height is almost what it is. It's not that clean because it's just not exactly that, but it's close to it. So you can see there's this, it looks light blue, and I really think it is light blue, that is supposed to be clear. Now, it almost makes the map look like a floodplain where like the seas have risen, global warming, and now we've got water flooding Seoul or something like that. But this is supposed to be clear terrain, but it just looks weird because the ocean water is such a darker blue, or a deeper blue, than what ends up showing up here, which is maybe not supposed to be blue to begin with, but it just sort of looks that way due to the color choices used between green and blue. It makes it seem more blue than it might actually be. It just looks a little weird, and it doesn't look as clean as it could be if it was maybe if it was just a brighter yellow type of color or something. But the actual terrain chart and the way that all of this stuff is supposed to represent, you can say the deepening color, the more red you are on a color wheel, the higher in elevation you actually are. So just in terms of the terrain chart, you see that very bland color is clear. The floodplain is clear. Then green is broken, which doesn't, again, thinking about it like a topographical map, not a, well, I guess that's just the way I'm going to reference it, broken. And then there's rough, and you can see the increasing movement point cost keeps getting higher and higher. So it is just like a incrementally more difficult kind of terrain, from clear to broken, broken to rough, rough to mountain, which is this sort of rust orange red, and then this deeper brown are the peaks, which you'll find in North Korea around the Chosin Reservoir area, and so on. Of course, there are roads and trails and railroads that all have different aspects to it. You can see some of these other things just as an example. I don't want to dwell on all of this right this second, but I just want to show that big difference in how the map is portrayed. Now, some folks may really, really like it, and I will say it will be clear as I play the game what terrain a hex is supposed to be. That will be, much will be clear. But as I just look at the map, it is not aesthetically pleasing to me, in the same way that the map from Korea Fire and Ice was. And so now it's a good opportunity to mention that last year, or maybe the year before, time flies, guys. I'm starting to lose track. I had reviewed another game on the Korean War, one that is newer, designed by Adam Starkweather as part of his OSS series, which was Korea Fire and Ice. So I have a whole series for that. You can watch the review video, also published by Compass Games. That was a game that was designed to be the first game in a series using a new system that was very interesting, very different, but managed to portray the Korean War in that system in a reasonable level of detail and enjoyment. And I don't want to repeat that whole review there. You can go watch that if you want. But I will say that the map from that game I found to be much nicer in terms of aesthetic. I just really liked the map. And compared to this, I don't think the map is as good looking. Now, that's a petty thing, and ultimately it may not really matter in the big scheme of things, but just something to throw out there. And throughout this series, as I go, I may make references to Korea Fire and Ice, just because it's going to be hard not to compare them in some way. I would like to do, maybe when I'm all done playing through the campaign game of this, maybe do some sort of comparison video and kind of talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of each. For sure, Korea Fire and Ice has a lot of cool, interesting things in it that I did like, but there are also a lot of weird things in it that I didn't like, or I know will certainly not be of interest to people, or just really hits it a different way that I think traditional wargamers may not like. And so for me, this is kind of a weird thing where, a lot of people played the Korean War first, and then they tried Korea Fire and Ice or whatever. Where I'm going at it backwards. I'm only playing this original classic now that it's been republished. So it'll be a little weird there. And to get this out of the way, because I know someone's going to put it in the comments, I will not be comparing this game to Korea, the Forgotten War from the OCS series. Not going to compare them. Why? Because Korea, the Forgotten War in the OCS series is a very different game in terms of scale. It is not proper to compare them. This game, the Korean War from Joe Balkowski, in Korea Fire and Ice, are more parallel to one another in terms of the level of detail and the playing time required to play through the game. So Korea Fire and Ice may be somewhere up there around 10 to 12 hours, maybe a little bit more than that, just depending. And then I think this game will be somewhere similar, maybe going up to 20 hours. That's guesstimating based on Board Game Geek numbers, so mileage may vary there. But I think Korea, the Forgotten War, and OCS can take dozens of hours potentially, and because OCS is a little bit more of an in-depth set of rules and systems acting together, I just see that as a very different sort of game. Though I'm sure folks will say Korea the Forgotten War is a great, fantastic game. It's OCS, it's awesome, and it's a best game on Korean War. That may be, but if you don't have that much time to play, Korea Fire and Ice and this game, the Korean War, probably easier to consistently play. So we'll explore that in this series as we go through. One thing I'll just throw out there too is that this game does do a little bit of an abstraction, but not as much as, say, Korea Fire and Ice. So the big dramatic thing with Korea Fire and Ice was that armor support or armored utility tanks were abstracted onto a track, and then depending on a number of different circumstances, you could apply some of your tank support to a given combat. Here, maybe thankfully for many people, armor units, tanks are handled as asset counters or asset markers. And so I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you guys can see. Ordinarily, when an asset is with a unit in this game, they should be underneath the unit that it's attached to, but for the purposes of setup, because I was trying to get things organized and I just wanted to make sure I knew where the tanks were, I have them on top. But here you can see, like, this is a 203rd battalion, tank battalion. So it's got a 8 tank strength and a 2 anti-tank strength here. And you attach this to a unit. So it was attached to the 1st North Korean division at the start of the scenario. And so what's really interesting is I do like to compare the force pools between games just to kind of see, if they're covering the same conflict, how do they represent things? So in, Korea Fire and Ice, the 105th Tank Division is not on map at all in that game because it's handled in the tracks. Korea, the Forgotten War in OCS has a very specific multi-unit formation for the 105th Tank Division. And then here, what's interesting is, like, if you want to compare, like, the 105th Tank Division is represented by these asset markers here, where let's see if I can make it a little bit easier to read for you guys, might be kind of hard. The 203rd, 107th, 109th battalions are units of that tank division. So you're not going to see references in this game to the 105th Tank Division because these tank asset markers are predominantly handled at the regiment level, but they're not really referenced as regiments, or I'm sorry, battalions. Gosh, not regiments, battalions, guys. I'm sorry. Battalion level, but the asset markers themselves are not designated as battalions. So there's a little bit of maybe gray area abstraction around how these counters are represented for the asset markers, but generally a tank asset marker, at least for the North Koreans, which are on the map right now, are the equivalent of battalions. And then broadly, the rest of these units that are on the North Korean side are divisions. So the 1st Division, this is the 6th Division, and so on, all divisional level, where the South Koreans at the start, these are all regiment-sized units. So they're much weaker. Just to compare the combat values here, you can see there's a 12 and a 7. So 12 attack value. I have these rotated a little bit differently, but 12 attack value, 7 defense for this big division. And by comparison, the South Korean regiment is a 2 and a 2 with a 1 anti-tank. So, as you would expect, the opening phases of this were going to involve the South Koreans getting, their butts kicked, unfortunately, and then forced south down along the peninsula. And the way things are set up now, as you can see, there's some forces near the border, some garrisons around Seoul, and then there's a few regiments scattered at some of the more important cities in South Korean territory. And then in North Korea, generally you have the divisions that are part of the attacking force here, some reserves behind. There are garrisons in some of the hexes that can be navally or amphibiously invaded. And then there's a couple of reserves back here in Pyongyang, in the glare area. Sorry for that. Hard to deal with that. I have plexi over most of the map, but not all of it, just due to plexi logistics. So there's a lot of interesting mechanics in this game, and we're going to kind of talk through those as we go through the game. There's a really interesting supply function where, and this is the one thing that's going to be really bizarre, where like Korea Fire and Ice, there's a supply track. You spend supply to activate HQs to do stuff. Here, there's a couple different chart lookups and die rolls to determine supply that you put on depots that then present levels that are rolled for on more charts to decide how many action points a unit can get and what kind of offensive stance it's in. And there's more die rolling and more chart checking. So what's going to be interesting as well, this game has a more traditional, again, compared to the other game that's from more recent years, this has attack, defense values, counters that have values on them to begin with, which Fire and Ice did not have. You would think, oh, well, there's going to be a lot of this combat ratio die rolling, and there is, but there is a whole lot of this overhead in the game where we're going to have to be referencing a lot of different charts that will give us a number or something that we will then need to look up on another chart and roll dice and look up something. And so there will be this continual sort of referencing that will probably slow down the game than what we might be used to in some other stuff. Not a big deal, but that's something we'll deal with. One of the other interesting things about this game is that you can break down certain units and you can merge certain units. So we could optionally try to take some of these South Korean regiments and fuse them into a division level counter, which is, it's interesting, right? And the pros and cons of that are that often when you put these regiments together, they're greater than the sum of their parts. The attack and defense values are actually greater than these individual numbers added together. Pretty cool. It also means that if you have a big unit that came on the board, but you need to cover more areas because you don't want the enemy maybe to navigate around you, being able to split units allows you to cover more ground with units and Zocs and that sort of thing, but they're individually weaker. So that's pretty nice. And in a lot of war games, you can have problems because the game has to pick a scale, whether that be brigade level, division level, corps level, or whatever. And being able to subdivide, you would just, it's not a computer game. A computer game, you can do that much more easily. In a board game, you have to kind of just pick what are the units going to be, how are they going to be rated, how are they going to move, and how do they interact. And this game adopts the stance that you're going to have big units, you're going to have smaller units. And the UN, the West, the NATO, well, I guess maybe NATO's not the right term. I should not use the term NATO. The UN forces, yeah, NATO doesn't apply in this case. The UN forces have some advantages as it relates to this, but both sides kind of have their own way of dealing with things. And there's also an interesting aspect where, for these divisions, if they take a step loss, it's sort of assumed that an individual division here is actually a 3-step unit. It's not the back that is its second step. It is, if this guy takes a step loss, he will actually be replaced by, I might have to double check this guy's placement, but I think he was there. He will be replaced by a replacement counter. That will be a 2-step counter, which can be reduced down to a 1-step counter and can be built back up with reinforcement points to try to build back up into the full division counter. And the UN has this whole weird, I guess not that weird, it's just they've got this own little subsystem about where units are at and who's being replenished. So there's going to be a lot of nuances that we'll explore here in the series. But generally, it's going to be, I think it should be pretty fun. I'm looking forward to this one, guys. I've kind of been wanting to do this for a long time. It's just been harder to get to it. There's a number of things. There will be UN naval invasions, maybe at Incheon, maybe somewhere else. There are support tracks. There are different things that will influence the combats that do occur. And there are even, there is an air component to this game, but it is very different from Korea Fire and Ice, which, because that game was sort of introducing a whole new system, even though the communists didn't have much of an air force to speak of really in the historical narrative, it had to create this underlying system for the way all the air combats would work, even in future games of the series. So for Korea Fire and Ice, there are some communist air units. You can have the air superiority fights and all of that, which was pretty interesting. But because this game, the Korean War, is just this game,
The air stuff is much more abstracted. You're not going to have air fights between, a UN plane and a MiG or anything like that. That's just not going to happen here. A lot of it's handled at a very high level, though the UN player will get, counters that have planes on them that have names that would be used to conduct like, ground support and all of that. And there's ways to calculate all of that. So we'll hit all that as well. Let's see that maybe the other thing I'll call out as an important difference between Fire and Ice and this. Fire and Ice had a really weird victory point system that I felt like I had to try to give some unofficial errata to make work properly, which is a real shame that's even a thing in Korea Fire and Ice I had to worry about. This game has something that I guess is just a much more straightforward victory mechanism that is easier to follow. So it is, basically the UN player will accrue victory points based on controlled objective cities. So, Seoul will matter. Occupying Pyongyang for some period of time will get victory points. Even some of these areas up here will be worth stuff. So on down here. And basically, those victory points, after being added up and compared to some things, will determine the level of victory. So it is a geographic control point based victory system. There's a few oddities to that related to the global tension system, which we'll have to talk about later. But it makes more sense. Like, you don't have to be thinking, you don't have to invent a new way of thinking around how to play the game to have it make sense. Like, yes, you will want to capture important territories. It will make sense to capture that. It will be important to capture those territories just as soon as you reasonably can. But there will be reasons to, be cautious about, as the UN player, crossing the border into North Korea. That factors into that global tension and Chinese intervention mechanic. So this game too, like the others, has a Chinese intervention mechanic. There are certain things that help trigger that. It is an inevitable thing. It will very likely happen at some point, unless your die rolls are really, really bad. And yeah, it'll be. I'm going to say this without having played the game yet, just reading and trying to connect the dots. The UN player is going to be looking at their victory point accrual and say, do we want to delay entering North Korea to reduce the likelihood of Chinese intervention, or do we feel like we're too behind the ball on victory points and we just need to do it early, knowing that it's more likely to trigger Chinese intervention, or will cause it to trigger sooner than we might have wanted to? And I recall in my game of Korea Fire and Ice, there was like, maybe we should delay a turn and just see what happens. I think that same kind of decision may come up here, which is good. I mean, if these mechanics all work together, it does mean that the people who are designing these games are kind of operating around some design intents for portraying the Korean War. And if they're all similar, it must mean, somebody's not way out near Pluto missing the mark here. In terms of where the camera's going to be positioned for the series, guys, I'm going to try to have it kind of like this a lot of the time, and we'll zoom in as I can. I'll also move the camera on top of the table. If I really want to zoom in on something important, we'll try to avoid the glares as I can. That will continue to be a challenge. But we are going to do the full campaign game. Buddy of mine, wargaming buddy of mine, when it comes to getting the game and talking about playing the full campaign or not, he would, if he was here, he would ask me, Stephen, are we mice or men? And I guess I would reply, I suppose we're men, so we're going to do the full campaign game. I thought about doing maybe just a smaller scenario to get my feet wet, but it's near enough the same as the start of the campaign game, right here, that we might as well just go big for it. Though I'm going to make one call out as we go through the series, which will be in the designer signature edition here. They included, I don't think this was in the original printing, they did include a way to follow the historical level of UN intervention and mobilization. So there is this whole system where the UN player has to decide, what is their level of commitment, mobilization, and intervention, and then escalation from the starting point. And that was left open to the player, the UN player, in the original, and you can still do that in this edition. That is the default assumption, is that the UN player will determine those things on their own, and those will have different game effects. But as a convenient thing, they included this is the historical designations for those levels and when to increase them. So if you don't want to fly off the handle and do something really crazy or accidentally do something really ahistorical, you can follow in the groove of history. And because I do want to see this game try to portray the Korean War as it happened, or as at least within the lane of reasonably feasible, I will be playing with that. So we are going to do the historical intervention commitment and mobilization levels, which some of these are going to be relatively low and will stay low, rather than push for like really hardcore intervention, which is more likely to mess with the global tension, which could cause World War III. And yes, that's a victory condition in this game. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the parts of the video that are relevant to those. But generally, what I'm going to look to do is, like I usually do in these full campaign series playthroughs, try to do a turn per video, for better or for worse. That may mean the videos are very long. There are 12 turns in this game, and those turns are divided into different action phases. So there's really like 2 main action phases where both sides will get to go in a given turn. So it's like you really have 24 goes as a side, your turns to move units and do stuff. So that should work out. We'll play it by ear. If it seems like the videos are really, really, really long, I might have to separate turns into separate videos, but we'll see. So for those who are watching this introduction and you are not interested in waiting and then watching hours and hours and hours of content, you can always leave off from here. I know a lot of people do that. They watch the introduction and then they don't watch anything else. They'll wait for the review. I'm perfectly okay with that. You can definitely do that. It may be a little while before we get to the actual review. For those who like to stick around and watch the whole dang thing, then yeah, you should expect to see videos that are like an hour long that cover a turn at a time, where I will, take some actions and then I'll kind of talk through what's happening and what the strategy is. And we may walk through the details of certain game mechanics, so you can see what they're like. That's more likely to occur in the first couple turn videos, where we're getting a feel for the system. I'm showing it, whereas later turns, I'm not going to feel the need to repeat all of that. I'm going to be doing a lot of die rolling and unit movement off camera, so that we're just getting through the rest of the game. I'm just playing through it, rather than demonstrating each and everything. The series should not be considered a how-to-play video series. That is not its intention. It is just to record and show me actually working my way through the game, warts and all. If that means I'm screwing up or something is confusing, you will see that confusion. I will explain hey, it looks like there's some missing errata here, I've got a problem, blah, 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 along the way. But fun journey for those who like to stick around and comment on it. I always appreciate the folks that do. Okay, so I think that is enough introduction. In the next video, I will start turn 1, which will start off, it's a kind of a reduced turn, which will just be the North Korean forces principally attacking South Korea during the second action phase of the turn. So it's sort of a half turn to start the game. So I guess it's not quite 24 goes, it's something less than that. But we'll start with that. I've got a little bit more setup to do with some of these tracks. I'm organizing the counters to try to make it coherent for myself. I still got to do a little bit more of that. So it still may be several days before you see that turn 1 video come up. It may even be a week, just depending on logistics and how things go from here. So yeah, excited, guys. This will be fun. And it's interesting to revisit a historical conflict in a different game from another designer to see, how folks choose to portray something. And already I can say there are a lot of similarities, just in terms of the intent. So in the OSS system, when units are done being activated, they flip, and they can be a little weaker when they're flipped, and that's considered fatigued. Well, sure enough, in this game, units that are flipped aren't a step loss. They're just fatigued, and their values are lower. They're not as strong, right? You go from a 12.37 to a 6.24, but it doesn't mean that unit took a step loss. They're just tired. They did stuff. And so managing your fatigued units was something that you had to do in Fire and Ice. We're also going to have to do in this game, maybe the OSS series, picked that up from this game. It's entirely possible. So anyway, gonna leave it at that, guys. Thank you for watching this introduction. There's a whole lot more that we'll cover. Just wanted to lay the groundwork so that you guys know where I'm coming from for this series. Yes, I will be making comparisons to Fire and Ice. Yes, I will be trying to work my way through the system and showing what I can. And my components may be a little different than your components if you've already gotten a copy of the game and your counter sheet is different. We've already talked through all of that nuance. Gosh, there's one other thing. I'm so sorry, guys. One other thing. It does appear that between the original version and this version, that there were some changes to the order of battle, the force pools in the game. Specifically, it seems like those changes are mostly in the Chinese division force pool. There are some units that appear to have not been included in the designer signature edition that may have been present in the original. I've tried to look at it and figure out what the deal was, why is something missing, is that impacting the game? It appears to be intentional. They did not forget to print these counters, as best as I can tell, because the counters that we would be considered missing from the old version to the new version are not asked for in the setups or the reinforcements, even though they may have been in the original game. Either those units are different units, or the force pool order of battle for the Chinese is smaller than the original. I'm not 100% confident I comprehend all of the differences. I am asking on Consim World to see if somebody can explain how intentional was this, what's driving the decision. So some folks, there's one guy on Board Game Geek who's having a fit over it because there's a couple of divisions missing. I don't know if that's a really bad thing or not at this point. If you're really bent out of shape because there's a particular Chinese division missing, I don't know what to tell you. The game setups, as far as I can tell right now, appear to be fine. Like, you have all the pieces in the box to play the game. Whether or not the game should or should not include a particular division, I did some research on Order of Battles online, and yeah, this division was involved in the war, but now it's not in the designer signature edition of the game. I don't know I don't know what to say about it, other than that is something that is different. There are other small rules changes that have occurred from the classic edition to this edition. A couple of different mechanics are handled slightly differently. So all of this appears to be intentional on the part of the designer or the publisher, or the publisher. Whether or not those could be considered bad things, I really can't tell you. But if we play through the game, the game is fun and it feels right to history and it is largely fine, then maybe it's really not a big deal and there's no use crying over it. I don't know. But if I get more information on these specific points, I will be sure to include that in another video or in a comment, and I will pin that in the comment section so you guys can see that. We'll see what happens. I don't know. All part of the process. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video for turn 1. And yeah, take care. Keep on gaming.